So I'm here today because I belong to a group that has somewhat dubious historical origins. So early practitioners of my tradition often claim to have access to supernatural powers and to possess esoteric knowledge that could only be granted to the worthy. And as a result, they communicated their messages in the form of cryptic allegorical parables so as to hide this knowledge from the uninitiated. These early adherents were persecuted and marginalized before eventually gaining acceptance by the world at large. And I'm of course speaking here of my heritage as a chemist. But perhaps you were thinking I was going to say something else. You see, chemistry finds its origins in the field known as alchemy. So alchemists believed that by contemplating certain philosophical ideals, things like reason and truth and beauty, that you could come to understand things that we would now call chemicals. And vice versa, they thought that by studying these chemicals, you could come to a greater understanding of higher philosophical ideals, like reason and like those reason and truth and beauty ideas. So, if the advance works, yes. So this is Maria Prophetissima. She was an early alchemist. She described probably the earliest apparatus for the distillation of compounds. And using this apparatus, she actually described how you can extract gold from plants. Next we have Jabir ibn Hayyan. He was an Arab alchemist in the 8th century. He discovered citric acid and first described crystallization. He also described the first synthesis of living snakes and scorpions from inanimate matter. Roger Bacon was a 13th century alchemist in England, described the first Western recipe for gunpowder, also the first Western recipe for turning lead into gold. And then Paracelsus, who is a Swiss alchemist, he is the father of modern toxicology, and he arrived at his conclusions through the venerable field of astrology, examining how the motions of the planets influence the action of chemicals in the human body. So it seems kind of hard to believe that the modern field that we know as chemistry was actually connected to this field of alchemy, that they actually grew up together. But then again, if we think about the paradigm for what a chemist looks like, it's someone who wears a funny coat and mixes chemicals in a strange container. And the paradigm for an alchemist is also someone who wears a funny coat and mixes strange chemicals in a container. So it took many centuries for the discipline of chemistry to free itself from the spurious influences of alchemy. Now, I'm also a Christian, and the historical narrative of Christianity is eerily similar to that of alchemy and chemistry. Historically, religion has had to work to disentangle itself from mythology on the one hand and superstition on the other. So mythology is the practice of inventing fictional tales in order to explain material events for which we have no credible explanation. So you see lightning and you invent a god named Zeus who wields the power of that lightning. Similarly, superstition is the belief that one type of event causes another in a way that runs contrary to reason and observation. So for example, if you find a 4-leaf clover, superstition says that you will have good luck. Now, historically, science has been one of the key tools by which we expunge mythology and superstition from religious thought and practice. So we can now explain how lightning occurs using the principles of chemistry and physics without invoking any bearded deities. And for superstitions, you can test whether finding a 4-leaf clover actually brings you good luck. For example, what if we genetically modify the clover to overexpress the 4-leaf mutation? Is that still lucky clover? Or what about a 5-leaf clover? How does the amount of luck scale with the additional number of leaves? All things that you can test. But the question then becomes, after applying the scalpel of scientific inquiry to something like religious faith, is there anything left? Does religion play a role in human thought, or does science explain it all? Can science explain everything? And lurking behind this question is a particular philosophy, which is called metaphysical naturalism. So metaphysical naturalism, in layman's terms, is the conviction that the natural world is all there is. The things that you can see and touch and smell, that's all that there is. And metaphysical naturalists often present a case that science, and in particular natural science, ought to be able to explain everything. After all, natural sciences study the natural world, and if the natural world is all there is, the idea seems to be that, well, yes, of course, there are things that science cannot explain right now, but eventually, given enough time, all those gaps will be, or at least could be, filled. But I think this idea fundamentally misrepresents what science can do. Science cannot explain everything. You see, even within methodological naturalism, there are things that science cannot explain. So science cannot explain why the Mona Lisa is beautiful. It cannot explain to me why auto racing is a sport. It can't explain to me why Kanye hates Tay-Tay. So there are lots of things that science is never going to be able to explain. Some of them important, some of them not so much. And broadly speaking, the reason science cannot explain everything is that there are two grand limitations on science. And those two limitations are reproducibility, namely the requirement that an observation needs to be able to be reliably reproduced by by another experiment, and objectivity, meaning that the same observation must be able to be made by different observers. These two principles are the bedrock of modern science. So for example, if I take an observation like potassium reacts vigorously with water, and I treat that as a scientific observation, that means that in Chem Lab, I can assign that experiment to you and expect that every one of you will get the same result. Because it doesn't matter who does the experiment or how many times you do it, potassium reacts vigorously with water. And if your potassium didn't react vigorously with water, I can deduct points because you did something wrong. But the thing is that these are the bedrock of science, but there are also limitations because not every observation is reproducible. Irreproducible, inexplicable things happen every day, and science doesn't prove that those things didn't happen. It merely declines to explain how or why. And likewise, not all truth is objective. And it's this second point that I want to dwell on for a few minutes. You see, any truth that is really worth something typically has an objective component, something that is independent of the subject, and also, though, a subjective component, a component that interacts with and penetrates the subject, namely you or me. So take, for example, the question of whether human activity is contributing significantly to climate change. Now, I'm not here to advocate one way or the other on this issue, but even if you were to accept that as being true, there are two different levels on which you could accept that truth, an objective level and a subjective level. On an objective level, you could analyze the data, and based on extensive modeling, you could conclude that, yes, human activity is having a measurable and significant impact on the global climate. But if at the same time you still drive an SUV, you still take long plane trips for your vacations, and you crank the air conditioning in the long Durham summers, while you might be agreeing with that truth on an objective level, you still not have accepted it as a subjective truth. Because in order for that truth to penetrate into you, you need to make a commitment, an investment in that truth. And that commitment, that investment will change you. It will change how you behave. And this investment in a particular truth is what most religious traditions call faith. Faith is this thing that translates an idea that might be objectively true in the abstract and makes it subjectively true in the context of your desires and your behavior, or my desires and my behavior. In order to make decisions and act, we all need to have faith. It need not be religious faith. One can have faith in a person, or faith in reason, or faith in the law of gravity, but Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, or atheist making decisions requires investing yourself in a truth, and that personal investment in the truth is not fully justified by scientific inquiry. And so for me, I have found the most satisfying source of that kind of subjective truth in the Christian tradition. See, as Christians, we believe that when we place our faith in Jesus Christ, then that person, Jesus, who was raised from the dead, comes to live in us. And fundamentally, what I believe in is the ability of that relationship to change me, to change who I am. And this change is very important to me because I have a problem. And the problem is this: I am a bad person. I'm not kidding. I do things that I know I shouldn't do, and I don't do things that I know I should. I have all kinds of moral maxims that I believe, things like tell the truth, do unto others as others would do unto you, turn the other cheek. I believe these things are true, and yet I'm constantly disappointed by my inability to live up to my own principles. Take prayer. As a person of faith, I would definitely say that I think prayer is important. Communication with the almighty creator of the universe. Email, on the other hand, not so important. But if you were to ask me how many times a day I pray versus how many times a day I check my email, I would decline to answer your question because the answer is embarrassing. And so I have this problem, and if you ask me when the problem started, well, it's been a long time. You see, in junior high and high school, I was a geek. Now, I know, you're sitting there thinking, wait, you're a quantum chemistry professor at MIT and you were a geek in high school? Get out of town! But it's true. I was too smart for my own good, I was socially awkward, I was unathletic, and to boot, I grew very quickly. And so you could count on it that 6 months out of the year, my clothes would be too small for me. And the unfortunate truth is that chicks don't dig tall, scrawny, awkward dudes who don't know how to dress themselves. So in the social structure of my high school, there were the popular kids, and then there were the kids like me. And I was one of those unpopular kids who desperately wanted to be cool. I thought if I could just get into the in crowd, then I would be content. And it didn't make me a very nice person. I shunned all the people that I thought were lower on the social ladder than I was. All the other people who didn't have the money to buy the right kind of clothes, or all the other members of my chemistry Olympiad team, who, in my defense, were far nerdier than I was. And life outside of high school didn't really turn out all that different for me. As time went on, I just found myself replacing popularity with any other of a host of ultimate goals. Good grades, success in my career, wealth, fame. I knew that none of them was likely to make me a good person. I even suspected that none of them was likely to make me a very happy person. But I wanted them just the same. Because the problem wasn't with high school or with MIT or with the in crowd. The problem is me. It's the way that I am. It's the things that I want. I am a bad person. And no matter how hard I work, it's never a problem that I can solve because I am the problem. You see, science can't help me with this. And even theistic naturalism, the idea that God exists and set the world in motion, that doesn't provide any aid here either, because if God just created the universe and set it in motion and then hung out a sign that said, be back in 25 billion years, I'm kind of alone. I'm stuck. Whatever I am is whatever I am. And most religions are even less help on this point because they tie our acceptance by God to our ability to accomplish a certain set of tasks or adhere to a certain set of rules. Only in Christianity does God provide the means for us to change who we are. You see, in Christianity, you don't do good as a way to suck up to God and prove how much better you are than all the non-believers. Morality in Christianity isn't a ladder that you ascend to draw close to God. In fact, the whole narrative of Christianity isn't about people drawing close to God. It's about God coming down to us. You see, the same God who set the universe in motion, who works in and through the natural laws, that same God provided the means, the bridge that can get us from who we are to who we were meant to be. And for me, that Christian framework, that Christian worldview, provides both the foundation for all the things that science can explain and the substance for the things that it cannot. So I'm looking forward to our discussion of this question. Thank you.
By way of introduction, a few relevant bits of detail. I grew up in Israel, and so that gives me a point of view on religion that I think is very different from the kind of point of view that one would develop growing up here. I grew up in a part of the world that on the one hand, I can claim as my regional heritage the articulation of the probably most successful articulation, at least by the numbers, of religious principles. And my favorite paragliding flight launches from Nazareth and lands at the Sea of Galilee. So these things are very real to me. On the other hand, this is a region which has been, and to this day tragically still is, undergoing bloody, gruesome, horrible fights and battles and wars, which are predicated on distinctions in religious belief to at least a very large extent. And so growing up in the Middle East gives you a point of view on religion and its place in your life that I think is a little bit different than the point of view one might acquire growing up in the modern United States. And so the result of that upbringing is that one has a somewhat critical view of religion. And I was joking before that my field of research is not that far from Troy's research. I also work on quantum physics. The quantum physics that I work on is something called string theory, which is an idea about ways to generate a quantum theory of gravitation, generalizing the theory of general relativity, and extending it to a quantum version. And string theory is very popularly described typically as one of two things. It's either the ultimate reductionist dream. It's the theory of everything. To some extent, that's what drew me. I wanted to do physics because I wanted to understand at the deepest level what the world is made of and how it works. And string theory is, in some sense, the vanguard of that effort in our day. And on the other hand, because of technical limitations, the fact that we don't really understand the theory, we don't even have a formulation that justifies calling it a theory, there are no experimental tests of any of the ideas, essentially, of string theory. And so it is described by many colleagues in the physics department as something between pure mathematics and religion. And so, in some sense, I do both science and religion, or neither. And I think we discussed this again, Troy and I, before coming in. And I certainly can answer the question, can science explain everything? Trivially. The answer is no. I already mentioned one thing science can't explain, which is why Arya isn't here. Science is certainly not going to explain what my girlfriend meant with that weird text I got this morning. And if anybody can by alchemy or religion or magic, then please see me after. I think that the reason that the answer is obvious but also worth discussing is because you really have to ask, what do you mean by everything? And I think that was one of the points that Troy made. And the other is, what do you mean by explain? Because the way that science explains things is in itself a somewhat limited form of explanation. Let me explain. Because that's what I do. So one of my favorite science talks of all times, and a few people here might have heard it, is where I explain to people why the sky is blue. This is a beautiful physics demonstration. You go through it in 20 minutes. It's very exciting. And to abbreviate it, I ask, well, you first have to define your terms because we're doing science. So the question I'm going to answer is, why is it that when I look on a sunny day up at the sky in a direction where the sun isn't, what my eyes perceive is light that is saturated in blue, that excites the blue receptor in my eyes more than the green or red? And the answer I give students is that it's an atmospheric phenomenon and that white sunlight scatters off the sky and higher frequency bluer light scatters more than lower frequency light. And as a result, predominant color of light that scatters off impurities or molecules of the air is blue light, and that's why I see blue light there. And conversely, the sunlight, which is white light being deprived of blue, appears to me as yellow. So simultaneously, I understand why the sun looks yellow. It's a beautiful explanation. But it's a limited explanation, because at some point, if you're going to follow it, somebody's going to raise their hand and ask, well, yeah, but why does blue light scatter more than red light, say? And then, depending on the level at which you want to address this, you can haul out Maxwell's equations, and you can study the interaction of radiation with charged matter, and you can assume some assumptions about the size of the scatterer, and you can derive an omega to the fourth relation. You can derive a mathematical relation that tells you this is true. And then, that's great, except somebody can then raise their hand and ask, well, why does light obey Maxwell's equations? And at that point, you're sort of stuck. I mean, if you want, you can regress further and say that there's an abelian gauge symmetry, but you're only doing more math. At the end of the day, light is the thing that satisfies Maxwell's equations, and we know that's true because we objectively and reproducibly managed to make predictions about light from using Maxwell's equations, so we know it's true. But there science stops. And there are a whole host of issues questions that are of interest to people, that science is, in some sense, not equipped to address, because even if you manage to generate a scientific answer, it would be completely unsatisfactory and useless. So, for example, Well, it goes without saying that I was a nerd in high school, right? I'm still a nerd now. And to boot, I was not only younger than my classmates, I was also, somewhat vertically challenged, and I still am now, though I'm not younger. And so I had to deal with social awkwardness, but there are the questions that I wanted to give it as an example of what science will not explain is when I had to construct the answer to questions like, I have these moral beliefs and I think I believe in them whether or not I'm able to live up to them. Why? And that's not a scientific question. Why do I think this is good? I mean, somebody can go and analyze some social utility function and optimize on some criterion, but that's not what I did. I sort of backed into them and I looked around and suddenly I believed in them, and it was I think it was Nietzsche who very wisely suggested that people's moral arguments for ethics typically are backfilling. They first decide what they want to believe in, and then they figure out an argument that justifies that from first principles. I'm going to admit that that's the way I do. I feel that I don't try, except I don't try to argue from first principles. Ethics is not axiomatic. I just can't do it. Math is not axiomatic. Well, it's going to try ethics. But there are things in my life that I get non-scientific answers for, right? What is it that makes me feel good, that makes me feel like a human? And the answer to that is, I don't know, the love that I share with my children and with my family and with my friends. And of course, somebody can come and tell me that the love you share with your children is explained as the evolutionary outcome of, there were humans who didn't care for their children, and there's not that many of them left over. The ones who cared for their children took over. Great. This is a brilliant explanation. It's absolutely true. There's no doubt. But it has nothing to do with the sensation or the feeling or the importance in my life personally that the love for my children has. And so I think that at some point I am what was the terrible word? A naturalist? I don't know what it is that exists beyond the natural world. I only observe the natural world. The way I know that, of course, I know, and then for particular, if you want to really get down to it, I don't even know the natural world exists. I just know that my perceptions of the natural world exist. And if I'm in the Matrix, well, it's pretty good software. It's well done. Those sushi recipes were written very, very well. I like the Matrix. It's a decent model. I like the Matrix on it. But, so I don't know that anything exists that is not in the natural world. I really don't have a way of knowing it. And I'm happy to deal with that. And in my model, those lovely children I was just talking about exist in the natural world. And my love for them has real, concrete and measurable effects. And you can notice that I love them and that they respect me at some level. A little bit. Sometimes. Maybe. I hope. But, and again, I would not be averse to someone telling me that at some point they will be able to run an fMRI or some super fMRI on my brain and actually point to some crazy pattern of neural connections that says, aha, this guy loves 5 children, whereas somebody else loves 7 children, but this guy only loves 5 children. So what? That would be a great advance in science, and it would probably be very useful, and it would save lives in some way. It wouldn't change the way I feel about my kids. So yeah, there are definitely important questions that science doesn't answer. Whether or not you believe in the existence of non-material things. I think even within the construct that the natural world is all there is, there are lots of interesting questions that science is just not the right tool to address. And I think that the conversation today is going to be a lot of fun for me, and I hope it's not too boring for everybody else. So thanks.
Hey, Ronan, Troy, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you guys for coming. You know, in the current issue of New Yorker, there's an article that I highly recommend it to you guys. The title is "What Does It Mean to Die?" By Rachel Aviv. It's the story of this person that underwent surgery, and something went really wrong and was declared brain dead. Her case was challenging, and it's sort of the lawsuit that is now taking place between the family and the medical establishment really challenges the way we think about existence, about consciousness, about what does it mean to be human. This is a section from that article. Ben Shulman is one of the physicians that was involved in the process. He was a college sophomore at Harvard. He listened to Chopin's Trois Nouvelles Etude No. 2 in his dorm room. And the music lifted him into such a state of ecstasy that he had an epiphany. He no longer thought it's possible that all conscious experience, particularly one's perception of beauty, can be a mere electrophysiological epiphenomenon, he said. The music seemed to transcend the spatial limitations of matter. An atheist, he converted to Catholicism. So tonight we're going to talk about, can science explains everything? Can it explain truth? Can it explain beauty? Can it explain meaning? What does it mean to be a human? In the era that when artificial intelligence is taking over almost all aspects of the human society, is there a fundamental difference between artificial intelligence and human intelligence? So I just, first of all, I want to, in this, as we start this sort of a question and answer period, I want to talk to the audience here, and I want to really encourage you to think about making the time that you're spending here with us meaningful. What do you expect to achieve from spending an hour and a half of your evening here? Are we, all of us, really willing to keep our convictions rather loosely and be open to be surprised and perhaps enlightened in the process? If you have taken any course in science, you probably have heard of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Werner Heisenberg was a very very prominent 20th century physicist. In his memoir, he writes, "What we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning." So we really cannot fully attain truth. We cannot fully put the truth in our box, whether being a religious box or a scientific box. Yet we do know that absolute truth exists. We do know that airplanes take off and they land. Yet truth remains elusive. We grasp for it, but it's somewhat out of the reach. That creates drive toward better understanding, better creating, improving, and so on. So can we think about science and faith as sort of orthogonal axis vectors towards reality? Can we think about science as a way to approach the understanding of the world of matter? Can we think about faith as a way to understand our value, our comprehension of this enterprise, and perhaps art helping us to understand the spirit of matter? After all, they share very similar attributes. We appreciate and acknowledge, hopefully, in science that we cannot have full control, full understanding of what we're doing. That's why we have never published our last paper. There is another one yet to come, right? Truth is unattainable. Approachable, but not attainable. The same thing in our faith. Approachable, but not fully realized. And because it's this lack of access to the absolute, then you need to have some tools at your disposal. The first one would be imagination, right? You have to use imagination in science. You have to do imagination in faith. as something that perhaps inspired from beyond. We use concordance to the norms of that discipline in which we engage. We do things in a way that our scientific culture or religious culture would put upon us, because we believe there is some collective wisdom in the norms that are operational in our domain of enterprise. And we use verification. We calibrate ourselves against our peers. We go to conferences. We publish papers. We go to church. We have small groups. We calibrate. So if you come up with an amazing religious experience, you want to verify it with your friends. If you come up with an amazing inspiration, scientific inspiration, you want to verify it. So you see, they have very similar methodological approaches. So how do we understand, given this so much similarity and yes, so much differences between science and faith, how do you think we can square our belief in God, that in the Christian tradition, a God that engages with humanity and nature, right? God is an active God in Christian faith. How would that God square with our understanding of science as a scientist? What do we think of that? That science is about cause and effect. So how do we square that God with the science? Maybe, Troy, maybe you can tackle that first.
So I think that's a terrific question, and it does highlight one of the real tensions between the worldview of methodological naturalism and what some Christianity, as well as many other religions, would hold, which is that many other religions hold that God can, of his or her own volition, intervene in the natural order in a way that may or may not jive with the natural laws. And I think it's hard to believe in something like Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Hinduism and leave that out. I think the one thing that scientific inquiry has taught us is that if that ever happens, it must be exceedingly rare that that happens, because it's not as if every single scientific observation that we've ever made is in harmony. It's just that almost every observation is in harmony. And so I think, but it is a fundamental question of, well, do we believe that, the times where it was in disharmony were because we made mistakes and it really just always would have been in harmony? And that's what I think methodological naturalism would hold. And most of the religious traditions would say, well, the fact that it's always in harmony, somewhere in those few points where there was not agreement, one or two of those might have been because of something that was outside of the natural order. So fundamentally, it's whether there's an admission that's possible or not.
So what do you think, Ron? Are these reconcilable in any way?
I think what Troy said, of course, is true. Science is never done, as you mentioned. One of the beautiful things about science, one of the reasons I believe in it, is that nothing in science is final. And you make another observation, you revise your science until it incorporates it. And there's a famous story about Pierre-Simon Laplace, a famous French astronomer and mathematician, who was presenting his theory of the formation of the solar system to Napoleon. And the story says that Napoleon asked him, well, you've given this beautiful description of the origins of the world, and you never once mentioned God. And Laplace is supposed to have said, I have no need for this hypothesis. Now, this is often quoted by naturalists of various kinds, and it's almost certainly untrue. But actually, when you follow up on what actually happened, I think it's an instructive story in the following sense. So the laws of celestial mechanics had been written a few decades earlier by Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton, who was the father of mathematical physics and probably the greatest mathematical physicist ever, had realized that the following interesting observation holds, that if you have two objects orbiting each other under the force of Newtonian gravity, then you get periodic orbits and ellipses and conical sections, and you solve the math. You have 3 objects orbiting each other under the influence of Newtonian gravity. The problem is what, well, Newton didn't have the word. Today we'd say chaotic. And there are disturbances that grow with time and render predictions impossible. Now, Newton had indeed analyzed the fact that, you know, the Earth's orbit is subject not just to the influence of the sun, but primarily that of Jupiter. And he realized that some perturbations could grow. And what Newton had suggested at the time is that precisely once in a while, it was the job of God to intercede and sort of straighten things out so that the planets continued in the orderly motions in which we see them. And what Laplace presumably did say in that conversation is that he had actually understood how to do perturbative analysis and study the stability of the solar system in its current configuration, and realized that for the next 100 billion years or so, there is no need to make corrections. And so, to some extent, the development that led from people trying simultaneously to learn how to distill chemicals and bring to life live snakes and scorpions, to modern quantum chemistry and our understanding of the uncertainty principle has to a large extent been the assumption that says when the data and your theory do not jibe, when there is a conflict, improve either your experiment or your theory or both until they coincide. And in some cases that took a century, some cases take decades. Eventually, we still have open questions. Of course, that's why we're here. Otherwise, we'd both be unemployed and really, really unhappy. But fundamentally, I think that when there is a discrepancy between observation and theory, either the observation is wrong or you improve the theory. I think that we have, and I think we have a huge number of examples. I gave you one in which a place where we have 2. One was lightning and one was Newtonian orbits, where regimes of experience that were relegated to the intervention of deities have been brought into some kind of scientific formulation. And I don't see, in the realm of natural phenomena, any reason to assume that there's a limit. And if there is, it would be very hard to incorporate in a scientific worldview, because then one would ask, okay, where? Our equations hold except when? And by definition, that's an untestable hypothesis, something that happens rarely, unpredictably, and incomprehensibly. I think by definition is not going to be captured by a scientific approach.
So Ronan, following up on that question, so if science can explain the mechanism of something, how or where we understand, for example, beauty in the brain, without the need for God hypothesis, or the utility of something, we also use science for engineering and for medicine, and it's very, very good, very good. So how would that necessarily answer the meaning question? In other words, where does meaning come from? And is it in the individual that construct the meaning, or it comes from, or do you construct the meaning, or do you discover it?
That is a very, very good question. And I think I acknowledged very openly that even when science gives you a perfect answer to the orbits of the planets, it stops at the limit of where it orbits, what it is able to tell you. And I think the example in the New Yorker piece that you gave is another wonderful and amazing example. I mean, the story is well worth reading. But one can ask 2 separate questions, for example, here. One is, if you are running a national health service or a national health policy, you have to decide at some point where you prioritize resources, and you optimize some utility, and you better approach it rationally. Independent of that, each of us personally has to decide what they consider a living human being and what they consider worthwhile. And if your rational optimization suggests killing a living human being, then most of us would at least have pause, though all of us, every one of us here, has in the past actively condoned the killing of living human beings. For example, we all use oil in our cars, and producing oil ends up killing oil workers. It's just a fact of life. So, but we don't feel comfortable. I think that the issue of constructing meaning is something that is the big challenge of being a human being, is to figure out where you find meaning, and it's a subjective and emotional thing, and it changes, and it's something that one should approach. And as I grow older, I increasingly use that word with the utmost humility and with the understanding that what you think defines you now is not necessarily what will do so tomorrow, and you learn new things. So no, science doesn't answer the question. Of course it doesn't. I think it's the beauty, the depth, the difficulty and the tragedy of the human condition is that it's up to you. And of course, I told my children something about what it is to be good and what life is about. And of course, they listened to it, and they paid attention to some of it, and they accepted some other part of it. But they're going to construct their own sense of meaning, and I think that's because they're full-fledged human beings. And that's what I want them to be.
So, Troy, how do you take that question? What does it mean? Where does meaning come from? And do we construct it, or do we discover it?
So I've always found that to be one of the strengths of religion, of religious traditions, is that it provides a natural way of thinking of meaning in the same way that we think of scientific truth. That scientific truth I think of as being out there. It's there. We have to work hard. We've got to discover it. We have to approach it with humility, because we might think we understand it now, and later on we find that we didn't really understand it. But it's not because the truth changed. It was because we changed. Our mind changed. We had this change of mind where we now understand it better than we used to. And I like to think of meaning in the Christian tradition. We think of meaning in that way, that there is an out there meaning that is, that exists, and that it's part of our walk to discover what that meaning is. And yes, our understanding of it may change, but it's not because fundamentally our purpose or the meaning of our life has changed. It's because we have become more enlightened, understand it better than we did last month or last year or 10 years ago. So for me, that's one of the things that's heartening about a religious tradition, is that it provides a backdrop that justifies, okay, that is a way to think about the search for meaning, in the same way one would search for scientific truth.
Mm-hmm. So you both of us brought the question of humility, the concept of humility. How would that shows itself in the religious tradition? And how would it show itself in the scientific tradition? Maybe Troy.
Yeah, sure. And I think that is something that is an excellent question to be put to many religious people, because they certainly don't seem very humble sometimes. There's a lot of religious people who seem to want to project that, well, I have it all figured out. Let me explain to you, you uneducated, unenlightened person, what the real story is. But I think any serious study of any faith tradition has to be done with humility, because, how could it not? Any step to faith is the realization that God is God and we are not. And so to approach that, anything with the utmost of humility, of saying anything that I have gained is almost nothing due to me and almost all due to God doing something. Because otherwise we couldn't make it. Like we couldn't, if God wanted to hide things from us, he could hide them from us. And so it all has to be God's reaching out to us in terms of learning anything about that.
How does that show up in your science?
So how does humility also show up? So I think the same thing is true in science, that, I have a tremendous amount of humility in the sense that there are these things that are out there that are amazing, whether they're discoveries that have been made or the discoveries that have not been made. And to feel like the universe works in such an amazing fashion, and to be able to discover something new that people haven't learned before, that's out there to be discovered, is really humbling. I think there's a different way that you could take it. It's like, well, I discovered this. But to think about all the things that we haven't yet discovered is, even if you're going to take pride in having discovered something, you still have to be humble with all the things you haven't yet discovered.
How do you answer that question?
So, yeah, it's interesting that you sort of said in faith and in science. So let me start with science. And in science, somehow to me, and science to me is a non-trivial part of the way I construct meaning in my life. One of the most meaningful things I do is that I am part of this amazing, noble human endeavor that's been going on since the days of the scorpions and the snakes, whereby many, many people, most of them a lot smarter than I ever will be, have slowly figured out unbelievably deep and broad and sweeping and incisive insights about the way the universe works, and have done that equipped with essentially a human mind. It's brilliant, it's amazing, and it sort of thinking about the whole endeavor, and then, if you magnify, then over there on the left corner, there's this little brick to which I contributed. You approach science with humility, and again, with all the humility, when you're thinking about it, that says, as I was once told by a shocked philosophy student that I was working with, she asked me some questions about quantum mechanics and interpretations, which is a thorny subject. And when I told her what I thought, she said, "Oh my God, you have no ontological conviction whatsoever." And I said, "No. I don't purport to actually know, as a scientist, what true reality is." It turns out that in the context of really carefully looking at it, trying to reconcile what we know about science with a model of what true reality really is, what philosophers technically call ontology, gets really complicated. And it's much simpler to say that what I understand is what we can measure and perceive. And I can make predictions and calculations, and I can, people smarter than me can build things with them. But true reality awaits, to the extent that I even know what that means, I can't really address. So that's the scientific humility. In terms of the humility of faith, it strikes me, and again, this is shaped indubitably by my experience growing up, that in accepting Judaism but not Christianity, or Christianity but not Islam, or Sabbateanism but not Mormonism, what you are essentially feeling is that I completely understand that what people who tell me that what I have found is some religious tradition whose insights and approaches speak to me and seem to me to be the backfill to the things that I feel. And this is why I adopted this religious tradition, despite the fact that I was raised somewhere else. And I have a great deal of respect for this. But to me, the statement that the faith that I profess is the one that describes ultimate reality, true reality, and all I am doing is improving in trying to discover the truth of, Jewish faith is a complicated subject, so I won't go there, because traditionally, as I've been in Judaism, faith doesn't come into it. But say Christian faith of this nature or that, or Hindu faith, if there is such a thing. I know very little about Hinduism. That seems to me, my humble approach is that I don't know what ultimate truth is, either in the physical world and certainly not in the world of ethics. And I attempt to construct such meaning as I can, and I realize that it's mine, and that most of it I've learned from other people, and it's subject to change. And what I consider progress today may turn out to have actually been a complete dead end, and I'll backtrack it. And that's the human condition. That's where I'm at.
So it seems to me like the whole, so in some sense, as a person of faith, you are an idealist. And as a person of science, you're also an idealist. But yet, really, that idealism, if it remain unguarded, can be very dangerous, as you refer to that in your own upbringing, right? So the humility is really the key ingredient that needs to be injected in both of those domains. Isn't that true? So building on that, you refer to that your upbringing a couple of times. And I was wondering if both of you can reflect on this, that how much of who you are today is influenced by your upbringing? So are we the pure result of our parents or where we grew up? You grew up in Indiana, you grew up in Israel, I grew up in Iran, and we brought that package with us. So how is that shaping your convictions today? And Troy, how's that shaping your conviction? Feel free to each one of you want to start first.
I'll go, okay. I'll jump. So I mentioned some of these things. I was brought up again by a family who, I mean, we all self-identify as Jewish, or as my daughter taught me to say, Jew-ish, and and Judaism is a funny, somewhat unusual religion, as in the sense that Judaism is not defined by faith or belief; it's defined by practice, and there are practicing Jews and non-practicing Jews, and I am, by any stretch of the imagination, a non-practicing Jew, and I was raised a non-practicing Jew. In fact, the generation of my parents, or the one before that, was the transition from Judaism as a religious practice to Judaism as whatever it is now, some kind of national identity, heritage. It becomes much more fluid. And that certainly is part of where I came to the conclusions in life that I hold today. But I have to say that there have been all kinds of other influences along the way. There are many ideas, ideals, ideologies that I held very strongly to, that I have come in my doddering old age to think second and third and more nuanced thoughts about. And so of course I'm a product of my upbringing. We all are. The challenge is to sort of not get stuck in it and keep growing, and I try. Not doing so well on the growing, but I'm trying.
So I was brought up in a Christian home. I left the faith when I was in college, and came back later. But so in some sense, I became a free agent for a while, then decided to go back to the home team. But I do wonder, how much of the fact that I was at least raised in that tradition and was familiar with it influenced, when it came to the point that I was like, no, I believe that God exists and that He's there. How much of my upbringing influenced my conception of what He was going to be like and how I should pursue that? And I mean, I tried to explore other options, but it's hard to honestly explore other options when you have experience in one. So I have thought about, well, how much of my direction was influenced by this is where I was brought up, and so that was where I, when the boomerang comes back around, that was where I was going to head.
I have one more question, and then after this, we're going to open up to the audience. If you have questions, just want to let you know this is probably my last question here. I have lots of questions, but I think we want to have a time to hear from you as well. Talking about the God hypothesis, that is not necessary in science, and I totally agree. In none of the papers that I have published, I mention God either. So I suppose you haven't done either. Okay, good. Because that's the way I approach it, is that that is not part of the tool set that we bring to science. It's not part of the tradition of science. But can we really pursue science without some element of faith?
I would say that it might be possible. I think it would be no fun whatsoever. And I don't see why I should try. So my pursuit of science is, well, to some extent, it's based on a belief that the universe is comprehensible. And I don't believe that the universe is ultimately comprehensible. I have no way, but people have talked about how fortunate we are that we managed to understand so much that mathematics is so unreasonably effective in describing our universe, we can actually write equations and their solutions match what we see. So I believe, at least in the worthiness of the endeavor, and I get great satisfaction from my little part in it. Sure, but so I think it's possible to do science without. I think we talked at dinner about the possibility of achieving scientific success by throwing a bunch of experimental data into an artificial intelligence deep learning algorithm and having it, extract theorems and equations. Well, that would be, in some sense, doing science. It would certainly not involve belief, and it would be absolutely no fun.
I find that they're paradoxical, actually, though, because in science we claim objectivity, we claim sort of no element of preordination of a sort, but we still have to bring that faith into the equation. Troy, do you want to take that question?
I would essentially agree that I think in principle it is possible. I mean, science is designed so that it is possible to do it with no element of faith. It's not possible to live as a scientist with no element of faith, but you could, in principle, do the science without any particular faith in how what the outcome was going to be. I think it would be hard for me to get out of bed in the morning if I didn't have faith in what the outcome was going to be. But in principle, you could just wake up, do it, leave the lab, go to bed, and that would still be the same scientific result would, by definition, result from that.